What you're about to hear are 3 real accounts from people who thought they were heading out for a peaceful weekend in nature. Instead, they encountered something that still keeps them awake at night. These stories were submitted to me personally, and I've changed the names to protect their identities. The first story comes from Vincent, a 28-year-old engineer from Oregon who learned that some campsites have histories you never hear about in the brochures. Vincent had been planning this trip for months. After a brutal work season designing bridge foundations, he needed to disconnect from everything: his phone, his laptop, the constant noise of the city. He chose Blackwood Campground in the Cascade Mountains, a spot his coworker recommended for its isolation. The drive up took 3 hours on winding mountain roads. Vincent arrived just as the sun was setting behind the towering Douglas firs. The campground was practically empty, just his truck and one other vehicle, a beat-up sedan parked near the far end of the loop. He set up his tent on Site 14, a secluded spot backing up to dense forest. The air was crisp, filled with the smell of pine needles and damp earth. As darkness settled, Vincent built a fire and settled in with a book, enjoying the crackling flames and the distant sound of an owl somewhere in the trees. Around 10 p.m., he heard footsteps on the gravel. Slow, deliberate steps coming from the direction of the other campsite. Vincent looked up from his book but couldn't see anyone in the darkness beyond his fire's glow. The footsteps stopped. "Hello?" he called out. No response. The footsteps resumed, circling his campsite just outside the ring of light from his fire. Vincent grabbed his flashlight and swept it toward the sound, but saw nothing except trees and shadows. The steps stopped again. This went on for 20 minutes. The methodical pacing around his site always just beyond where his light could reach. Vincent considered walking over to the other campsite to see if someone was playing a prank, but something about the deliberate nature of those footsteps made him stay put. Finally, the sound moved away, heading deeper into the forest. Vincent tried to return to his book, but concentration was impossible. Every small sound, a branch creaking, leaves rustling, made him look up. Around midnight, he decided to turn in. As he was banking his fire, he heard a voice, quiet, almost conversational, coming from the woods behind his tent. Vincent. His blood went cold. The voice knew his name. "Vincent, come here." It was a woman's voice, calm and pleasant, like someone calling him for dinner. But Vincent hadn't told anyone at the campground his name. He hadn't spoken to another soul since arriving. "Vincent, I need to show you something." The voice was moving, circling his campsite again, staying just inside the tree line. Vincent grabbed his flashlight and car keys, ready to leave if necessary. "Don't be afraid, Vincent. Just come to the trees." The voice was different now, still female but deeper, with an odd echo like someone speaking into a well. Vincent made a decision. He threw his sleeping bag and essentials into his truck and drove straight back to town, leaving his tent and camping gear behind. He spent the night in a motel and returned the next morning with a park ranger to collect his things. The ranger, a weathered man named Bill, wasn't surprised by Vincent's story. "Blackwood's got a reputation," Bill said as they packed up Vincent's abandoned campsite. "We get reports like this maybe 3-4 times a year. Always the same thing, voices calling people by name, footsteps, that kind of thing." Bill paused, checking Vincent's tent stakes. "Funny thing is, we keep detailed records of who camps where and when. Last week, I pulled the logs going back 15 years for Site 14. You know what I found?" Vincent waited. For people have abandoned their campsites in the middle of the night. All of them reported hearing their name called from the woods. But here's the thing, none of them had registered under their real names. They all used fake names on the permits. Vincent's throat went dry. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying whatever's out there knew who they really were." Brian thought he had everything figured out. 26 years old, an experienced backpacker who'd hiked sections of the Appalachian Trail and spent countless nights alone in the wilderness. He prided himself on being prepared for anything nature could throw at him. This particular trip was a solo journey into the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. Brian planned to spend 4 days hiking a remote loop trail, camping at designated backcountry sites. He'd done his research, checked the weather, and informed the ranger station of his itinerary. The first 2 days went perfectly. Clear skies, moderate temperatures, and stunning views from the ridgeline. Brian felt that familiar peace that only comes from being completely alone in the wilderness, miles from the nearest road. On the second night, he made camp at Hemlock Hollow, a small clearing surrounded by ancient trees. The site had a fire ring and a weathered picnic table, signs that other backpackers had used the spot, but Brian hadn't seen another person in 2 days. He prepared his dinner as the sun set. Freeze-dried beef stew heated over his camp stove. The forest was alive with the usual sounds. Crickets, a distant barred owl, the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Brian was cleaning his cookware when he heard it. A branch snapping, but not the small crack of a squirrel or bird. This was substantial, like someone stepping on deadfall. He looked up from his camp stove and listened. The normal forest sounds had stopped. Complete silence, as if every living thing was holding its breath. Then he saw it. About 50 yards away, barely visible in the fading light, stood a figure. Human-shaped, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, standing perfectly still among the trees. Brian called out, "Hey there, you okay?" No response. The figure didn't move. Brian reached for his headlamp and clicked it on, directing the beam toward the trees. Nothing, just forest. He convinced himself it was a trick of the light, maybe a dead tree that looked human-like in the shadows. Brian finished cleaning his gear and settled into his tent around 9 p.m., listening to a podcast on his phone with one earbud in, keeping the other ear free to monitor the sounds outside. Around 2 a.m., he woke to the sound of his camp stove igniting. Brian sat up in his sleeping bag, heart hammering. Through the thin wall of his tent, he could see a flickering blue light, the flame of his stove burning. But he'd packed it away hours ago. He listened for movement outside but heard nothing except the soft hiss of burning gas. Brian grabbed his knife and slowly unzipped his tent door, peering out into his campsite. His stove sat on the picnic table, flame burning bright blue in the darkness. Next to it, his cookpot sat heating empty, just metal heating over the flame. Brian stepped out of his tent, knife in hand. "Who's there?" The forest was dead silent. No wind, no insects, no movement at all. He approached the stove and turned it off, the sudden darkness making everything beyond his immediate area disappear. That's when he noticed his food bag hanging from the bare cable wasn't where he'd left it. The rope had been untied and retied, but wrong, not the knot he'd used. Something had been through his supplies. Brian packed everything he could fit into his backpack in under 10 minutes, leaving behind anything non-essential. He hiked out by headlamp, following the trail markers back toward the trailhead. It took him 6 hours of night hiking to reach his car. 3 days later, Brian called the ranger station to report what had happened. The ranger he spoke with, a woman named Janet, listened to his account without interruption. "You said Hemlock Hollow?" she asked when he finished. "Yes. Site marker H7. Mr. Brian, we haven't maintained that site in 8 years. It was closed due to, well, let's call them ongoing issues. The trail markers you followed, they shouldn't exist anymore. We removed them." Brian felt his mouth go dry. "But I have pictures. My GPS coordinates." "I'd like to see those pictures," Janet said. "Because according to our records, the last person to officially camp at Hemlock Hollow was a backpacker named Tom Schneider. That was in 2016. He reported someone going through his campsite at night, tampering with his equipment. Just like you described." She paused. "Tom hiked out early too, but he came back 2 days later with a park ranger to collect the gear he'd left behind. They found his campsite exactly as he'd described: stove on the table, food bag retied. But Tom had been dead for 3 days when they found the site." "What do you mean dead?" "His body was discovered at the bottom of Raven's Drop, about 2 miles from Hemlock Hollow. The medical examiner said he'd fallen sometime during his first night out. But if that's true, who set up the campsite? Who lit the stove?" Loretta had been looking forward to this trip for months. She and her 3 friends, Jesse, Ivan, and Sam, had planned a weekend at a remote lake in northern Michigan, far from cell service and civilization. They'd rented a small cabin through a private owner, someone who advertised complete privacy and seclusion. The drive took them down increasingly narrow dirt roads until they reached what looked more like a hunting camp than a vacation rental. The cabin was small but clean, with a dock extending into a dark, mirror-still lake surrounded by dense forest. "This is perfect," Jessie said as they unloaded their gear. She was the group's photographer, always looking for that perfect shot of untouched nature. The first day was everything they'd hoped for. Swimming in the surprisingly warm lake water, grilling burgers on the cabin's small deck, and staying up late around a fire pit telling stories from college. They were all in their early 30s now, successful in their careers but nostalgic for simpler times. Ivan, who worked in IT, had brought a small generator to keep their phones charged for emergencies, though none of them had signal anyway. Sam, always the practical one, had mapped out hiking trails around the lake for the next day. It was Loretta who first noticed something was off. She'd gotten up around 3 a.m. to use the bathroom and glanced out the window facing the lake. In the moonlight, she could see someone standing on their dock, a figure in what looked like old-fashioned clothes, a long dress or coat that seemed to float around them. Loretta assumed it was Jessie, who sometimes couldn't sleep and liked to take night photographs. But when she turned to check, Jessie was sound asleep in the bunk bed across from her. Loretta looked back out the window. The figure was gone. The next morning, she mentioned it to the others over coffee. "Did anyone go outside last night?" "I slept like a rock," Sam said. "First good night's sleep I've had in months." Ivan and Jessie said the same. They all assumed Loretta had been dreaming, and she began to think so too. That evening, they decided to have a campfire down by the water instead of up at the cabin. The lake was perfectly calm, reflecting the stars like a black mirror. Ivan had brought his guitar, and they spent hours singing old songs and reminiscing. Around 11 p.m., Jessie decided to take some night photos of the lake. She walked down to the end of the dock with her camera while the others continued talking around the fire. She came back running. "There's something in the water," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Something big." They all walked down to the dock with flashlights. The lake was still perfectly calm, but about 20 feet from shore, they could see ripples forming in a perfect circle, as if something large was moving just beneath the surface. "Probably just a beaver," Sam said, but his voice lacked conviction. The ripples moved closer to shore, maintaining that perfect circular pattern. Whatever was causing them had to be substantial. The disturbance was at least 10 feet across. Then the water began to glow. A soft, greenish light emanated from beneath the surface, growing brighter as the ripples approached the dock. The four friends stood frozen, watching this impossible sight. "We should go back to the cabin," Loretta whispered. But before they could move, something broke the surface. It wasn't an animal. It looked like a person, or what had once been a person. Pale, waterlogged skin and long hair that floated around a face that was wrong somehow. The features were human but stretched, distorted, as if the face had been underwater for a very long time. The thing looked directly at them with eyes that reflected their flashlight beams like an animal's. Then it smiled, revealing teeth that were too long and too sharp. Jessie screamed. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had held them in place, and they ran for the cabin, slamming the door behind them and throwing the deadbolt. "What was that?" Ivan kept saying. "What was that thing?" They huddled together in the main room, afraid to look out the windows. Outside, they could hear splashing sounds from the lake, and occasionally, what sounded like footsteps on the dock, wet, slapping sounds like bare feet on wood. Around 4 a.m., the sounds stopped. They waited until full daylight before venturing outside. The dock was covered in lake weeds and what looked like muddy handprints. The wooden planks were warped and rotted in places, as if they'd been soaked for years instead of hours. They packed and left immediately, driving straight back to the city without stopping. 2 weeks later, Loretta tried to contact the cabin's owner to report the incident and request a partial refund. The phone number went to a disconnected line. She searched online for the rental listing but couldn't find it. Curious, she drove back to the area with Sam, following the same route they'd taken. But when they reached what should have been the final turn onto the dirt road leading to the cabin, there was nothing there. Just unbroken forest. They asked at a gas station in the nearest town about the lake and the cabin rental. The elderly clerk looked at them strangely. "Ain't been no cabins up there for 30 years, he said. "Not since the Hendricks place burned down. That whole area's been state forest since the 90s. Loretta showed him the photos on her phone from their trip, pictures of the cabin, the dock, their campfire. The clerk studied them for a long moment. "I'll be damned," he said quietly. "That's the Hendricks place, all right. But miss, that cabin burned to the ground in 1994. Whole family died in the fire, parents and their teenage daughter. They never found the girl's body, though. Figured she might have tried to swim across the lake to escape the flames." He handed her phone back. "Lake's been empty ever since. Folks say it's cursed or haunted or some such. Nobody goes up there anymore." Music builds to crescendo, then fades. Those were 3 real accounts from people who thought they were going on ordinary camping trips. If these stories gave you chills, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more true horror stories. I read every comment, so let me know your thoughts below. And remember, sometimes the most beautiful, isolated places have reasons for being isolated. Until next time, stay safe out there.